There are moments in the history of American media when the tension between corporate interest and journalistic integrity becomes impossible to ignore. Moments when the quiet machinery of executive decision-making grinds loudly enough that the public can actually hear it. And in the spring of 2025, one of those moments arrived not in a newsroom, not in a courtroom, but in the aftermath of a late-night television interview. An interview that millions of Americans never got to see the way it was originally intended. This is the story of CBS, Stephen Colbert, a Democratic politician, and an accusation that cut to the very heart of what it means to be a free press in an era of unprecedented corporate and political pressure. This is the story of what critics called corporate capitulation, and why it matters far beyond the world of late-night television. To understand what happened, you need to understand the landscape of American media as it exists today. The major broadcast networks, ABC, NBC, CBS, are no longer simply television companies. They are subsidiaries of enormous multinational conglomerates with fingers in virtually every corner of the global economy. CBS is owned by Paramount Global, a media giant that has, in recent years, been navigating a turbulent sea of financial pressure, regulatory scrutiny, and the kind of existential uncertainty that comes with trying to survive in the streaming era. And like all large corporations, Paramount Global has interests, business interests, regulatory interests, political interests that extend far beyond what appears on your television screen on any given night. Stephen Colbert, the host of The Late Show on CBS, has been one of the most prominent voices of political satire and commentary in American television for the better part of a decade. Since taking over from David Letterman in 2015, Colbert transformed the program from a relatively light entertainment vehicle into something with real cultural and political weight. His monologues became must-watch television during the Trump years. His interviews drew serious political figures. His show became, for millions of Americans, one of the few places where the absurdities and dangers of contemporary American politics could be examined with both rigor and humor. But Colbert's relationship with CBS has never been without friction. The very nature of his work in pointed, politically engaged, unafraid to name names and call out powerful figures, puts him in a permanent state of creative tension with the corporate structure above him. That tension, which had always simmered quietly beneath the surface, burst into public view when reports emerged that CBS executives had intervened in the editing and presentation of an interview Colbert conducted with a prominent Democratic politician. The details of the interview itself are important, but so is the context surrounding it. The interview took place at a moment of intense political polarization in the United States, a moment when the relationship between the media and the government was under extraordinary strain. The Trump administration, having returned to power, had made the targeting of what it called fake news and enemy media a central feature of its political strategy. Regulatory agencies, including the Federal Communications Commission, were being scrutinized for potential use as tools of political pressure against media companies perceived as hostile to the administration. Paramount Global, as a major broadcast company, was subject to FCC oversight, a fact that created an uncomfortable dynamic when it came to editorial decisions that might provoke government displeasure. It was into this charged atmosphere that the Colbert interview landed. According to reports and sources familiar with the situation, the interview in question involved a candid and substantive conversation between Colbert and a Democratic figure, the kind of interview that in a normal media environment would have aired in its entirety without fanfare. But something happened between the recording of that interview and its broadcast. Portions of the interview, it was alleged, were edited or altered in ways that softened its political edge, that blunted the sharpest moments of the conversation, that rendered it less likely to provoke controversy, or more specifically, less likely to provoke the kind of controversy that might draw unwanted attention from a government already looking for reasons to scrutinize CBS and its parent company. When news of this alleged editorial interference began to circulate, the reaction was swift and fierce. Media critics, press freedom advocates, and political commentators converged on the story with unmistakable alarm. The Guardian, one of the world's most respected newspapers and a publication with a long history of holding powerful institutions accountable, was among those to cover the controversy in depth, framing it in terms that were deliberately provocative. CBS, the coverage suggested, stood accused of corporate capitulation, of bending to political and commercial pressure in ways that compromised its journalistic independence. The phrase corporate capitulation is worth unpacking because it carries a lot of weight. Capitulation, in its most basic sense, means surrender. It means giving in to a force that you have the power to resist but choose not to resist. When applied to a media organization, it implies something deeply troubling, that decisions about what the public sees, hears, and knows are being made not on the basis of journalistic merit, not on the basis of truth or public interest, but on the basis of corporate self-interest, on the basis of what is most convenient or least dangerous for the business. And if that is what happened at CBS, if executives really did intervene in the Colbert interview for reasons rooted in corporate risk management rather than editorial judgment, then it represents a profound failure of the media's fundamental obligation to the public. To appreciate why this story resonated so deeply, you have to understand what late-night television has historically meant in the American cultural landscape. The late-night talk show has always occupied a peculiar and important space in American life. On the surface, it is entertainment. Comedy, celebrity interviews, musical performances, the light and breezy fare of a nation winding down at the end of the day. But beneath that surface, late-night television has often been a vehicle for something more serious. Johnny Carson could shape public opinion with a single raised eyebrow. David Letterman could puncture the pretensions of the powerful with a well-timed quip. And in the era of Trump, Colbert and his peers, Jimmy Kimmel, Seth Meyers, John Oliver, became something close to an informal opposition, using humor as a weapon against what they saw as the dangerous absurdities of the political moment. This is not a role that late-night hosts simply stumbled into. It reflects a long tradition in American culture of using comedy and satire to speak truth to power, a tradition that runs from Mark Twain through Will Rogers, through the original Saturday Night Live, through Jon Stewart's Daily Show, which fundamentally changed what political satire on television could look like. Colbert himself came out of that tradition, having spent years as a correspondent on The Daily Show before taking over The Colbert Report and then The Late Show. His entire career has been built on the premise that comedy and political engagement are not opposites, but allies, that laughter can be a form of accountability, that satire can do what straight journalism sometimes cannot. All of which makes the alleged interference in the Colbert interview particularly significant, because if CBS executives were willing to reach into a late-night talk show and soften its political content, it raises a question that goes far beyond the specifics of one interview. How much of what we see on television is shaped not by the creative and journalistic instincts of the people making it, but by the corporate and political calculations of the people paying for it? This is not a new question. Media critics and scholars have been asking versions of it for decades. The consolidation of American media into the hands of a small number of massive corporations, a process that accelerated dramatically in the 1990s and 2000s, has always carried with it the risk that corporate interests would override journalistic ones. When your television network is owned by a company that also has interests in telecommunications, theme parks, pharmaceutical advertising, defense contracting, or any number of other industries with heavy regulatory exposure, there is an inherent structural pressure toward caution, toward not making waves, toward not producing content that might invite government scrutiny or corporate backlash. In the past, media organizations managed this pressure through a combination of editorial independence, the formal separation of the newsroom from the business side, and journalistic culture, the set of professional norms and values that journalists internalize and that serve as a kind of immune system against external pressure. But that immune system has been weakened over the years by financial pressures, by layoffs, by the decimation of local news, by the rise of digital media that has disrupted traditional business models and left many news organizations in a state of permanent financial anxiety. And when a media organization is financially vulnerable, when its parent company is under regulatory pressure, the barriers between corporate interest and editorial independence can start to erode in ways that are subtle but consequential. The CBS Colbert situation arrived at a particularly fraught moment for Paramount Global. The company had been navigating a proposed merger that required regulatory approval that would need to come from a government that had already demonstrated a willingness to use regulatory power as a tool of political pressure. This context is crucial because it provides a potential explanation, not a justification, but an explanation for why CBS executives might have felt pressure to avoid content that could complicate the company's regulatory situation. If you are a corporate executive trying to shepherd a major business deal through a regulatory process overseen by a politically antagonistic administration, the last thing you want is for one of your flagship programs to produce content that gives that administration an excuse to make your life more difficult. Critics, of course, argued that this kind of reasoning, even if it accurately describes what was going on in the minds of CBS executives, represents exactly the problem. Because once you accept the premise that editorial decisions should be shaped by corporate regulatory needs, you have fundamentally compromised the independence that gives journalism its value. A press that filters its content through the lens of what is most convenient for its parent company's business interests is not a free press. It may look like one, it may dress itself in the language of journalism, but it has surrendered the essential thing that makes journalism matter. The reaction from within the media industry was telling. Journalists and media figures who spoke out about the CBS Colbert situation were not, by and large, people who agreed on everything politically. They came from different parts of the political and media spectrum, but they shared a common alarm about what the situation seemed to represent: a precedent, a signal, a demonstration that even prominent, well-established television programs were not immune to the kind of corporate pressure that critics had long warned about. Some of the most pointed commentary came from people who knew the late-night television world from the inside, former writers and producers who understood how these shows were made and what kind of editorial culture was necessary to make them work. They emphasized that a show like The Late Show depends at a fundamental level on trust. Trust between the host and the audience, trust that what you are seeing reflects genuine creative and journalistic instincts, rather than the filtered output of a corporate risk management process. Once that trust is broken or even seriously questioned, it is very difficult to rebuild. And this is where the story connects to something much larger than CBS, much larger than Stephen Colbert, much larger than any single interview or any single editorial decision. It connects to the fundamental question of what kind of information environment Americans will have in the years and decades ahead, and whether that environment will be one that serves the public interest or one that serves the interests of the corporations and political forces that have the most power to shape it. The American media landscape is in the middle of a transformation that has no clear endpoint and no obvious outcome. The rise of streaming has disrupted the traditional broadcast model. Social media has fragmented the audience in ways that make it increasingly difficult to maintain the kind of shared informational reality that democracy depends on. The economic model that supported serious journalism, advertising revenue, subscription revenue, the profitable mass audience, has been eroded by technological change. And into this environment of disruption and uncertainty, concentrated corporate power and political pressure have found new opportunities to exert influence over what gets reported, what gets broadcast, what gets seen. The Colbert situation, if it happened the way critics alleged, is a symptom of this larger problem. It is what happens when a media organization is financially dependent, when its parent company is politically exposed, and when the people at the top of that organization prioritize corporate survival over editorial integrity. It is a reminder that the structural conditions for press freedom, genuine editorial independence, financial sustainability, protection from political retaliation, cannot be taken for granted, that they have to be actively defended, that they can be eroded quietly and gradually until one day something happens that makes the erosion visible. There is a long history of this kind of erosion in American media, and it is worth briefly revisiting some of it because it provides context for why the CBS Colbert story struck such a nerve. In 2004, CBS itself faced intense political pressure over its 60 Minutes report on George W. Bush's National Guard service, a report that, whatever its evidentiary shortcomings, was ultimately dropped in circumstances that many journalists believed reflected corporate capitulation to political pressure. The episode damaged CBS News's reputation and contributed to a broader chilling effect on investigative journalism at major networks. Similarly, in the run-up to the Iraq War, the major broadcast networks were widely criticized for failing to challenge the Bush administration's claims about weapons of mass destruction, a failure that many media critics attributed in part to a corporate climate that was disinclined to produce content that might be seen as unpatriotic or that might disrupt the comfortable relationship between major media companies and a popular wartime president. These were not isolated incidents. They were manifestations of a structural dynamic that never really went away. The dynamic in which corporate interest, political pressure, and editorial decision-making become entangled in ways that compromise the independence of the press. Now, in 2025, that dynamic has returned in a new form, shaped by a new political environment and new corporate pressures. And critics argue that the response needs to be more than outrage. It needs to be a serious reckoning with the structural conditions that make this kind of capitulation possible. That means thinking seriously about regulatory frameworks that protect editorial independence. It means thinking about alternative ownership models, nonprofit news organizations, public media, cooperative ownership that reduce the exposure of journalism to corporate and political pressure. It means supporting journalists and editors who push back against inappropriate editorial interference and holding accountable those who enable it. But it also means something simpler and more personal: paying attention. The story of CBS and Stephen Colbert gained traction because people paid attention, because journalists and media critics and ordinary viewers took it seriously and refused to let it disappear into the daily flood of news and noise. That kind of public attention, that insistence on accountability, is itself a form of press freedom, a way of pushing back against the forces that would prefer the erosion of editorial independence to happen quietly and without comment. Stephen Colbert, for his part, has never been someone who shies away from difficult conversations. Over the course of his career, he has demonstrated a willingness to take on powerful institutions, to speak uncomfortable truths, to use his platform in ways that go beyond mere entertainment. Whether he spoke publicly about the specific circumstances of the interview controversy, whether he pushed back behind the scenes, whether the situation affected his relationship with CBS and its parent company. These are questions whose answers may not be fully known for some time. But his very presence in this story, the fact that it was his interview at the center of the controversy, carries a certain symbolic weight. Because Colbert represents a tradition, the tradition of the engaged, politically serious entertainer who uses humor and wit as tools of accountability. That tradition has a long and important history in American culture, and its vitality depends on the conditions that allow it to flourish: creative freedom, editorial independence, the protection of artists and journalists from the kind of corporate and political pressure that would blunt their work and narrow their vision. When those conditions are compromised, when a network executive somewhere decides that it is safer to soften a political interview than to air it in full, something real is lost. It is not lost dramatically, not with a bang, but quietly, incrementally, in the spaces between what was said and what was aired, between what was recorded and what was broadcast. And those quiet losses accumulate over time until one day, the gap between what the public knows and what the public needs to know has grown wide enough to matter in ways that are difficult to recover from. The Guardian's coverage of this story, framing it as an accusation of corporate capitulation, was itself an act of journalistic courage, a willingness to name what was happening clearly and without euphemism, to hold a major American media institution accountable in terms that were direct and unsparing. And that is worth acknowledging because in an environment where so much media coverage is shaped by institutional caution and the fear of offending powerful interests, directness and clarity are not always as common as they should be. What happens next in this story, how CBS responds to the criticism, how Colbert's show navigates its relationship with its corporate parent going forward, how Paramount Global's regulatory situation develops, and what precedent this episode sets for how other media organizations handle similar pressures. All of this remains to be seen. But the questions raised by this controversy are not going away. They are embedded in the structural realities of American media, in the concentration of corporate power, in the political dynamics of an era defined by aggressive executive assertion and the systematic targeting of perceived media enemies. These are the questions that define the information environment we all live in, not just Americans, because what happens to the American media, the largest and most influential media ecosystem in the world, has consequences that ripple outward in every direction. When a major American network is accused of softening its political coverage under corporate or political pressure, it sends a signal not just to other American media organizations, but to media institutions around the world that even in the country that wrote the First Amendment into its founding document, the freedom of the press is not a fixed, permanent reality, but a contested, fragile achievement that can be eroded whenever the conditions are right. And so this story, which might seem on the surface to be about a late-night talk show host and a disputed interview edit, is really about something much more fundamental. It is about the conditions of democratic life, about the role of a free press in a functioning democracy, about the structural forces that threaten that freedom in ways that are often less visible but no less dangerous than outright censorship. It is about the difference between a press that tells truth to power and a press that calculates the cost of truth and decides it cannot afford it. The charge of corporate capitulation is a serious one. It deserves a serious response, not just from CBS, not just from Paramount Global, but from everyone who depends on a free press to make sense of the world they live in, which is to say, it deserves a response from all of us, because the freedom of the press is not ultimately a privilege belonging to journalists and media executives. It is a public good, something that exists to serve the public, that belongs to the public, and that the public has both the right and the responsibility to defend. And that defense begins exactly where it should, and with paying attention, with asking hard questions, with refusing to let the quiet erosions of press freedom pass unnoticed into the noise of an endless news cycle. It begins, in other words, with exactly the kind of story that The Guardian chose to tell, and exactly the kind of scrutiny that a story like this deserves.